This session will be commencing in just a few moments. Order, please. À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît. The sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission is now in session. Commissioner Hogue is presiding. Cette séance de la Commission sur l'ingérence étrangère est maintenant en cours. Le commissaire Hogue préside. The time is 10 o'clock. Il est 10 heures du matin.
So good morning, everyone. Alors, bonjour.
Good morning. First things first, participants were informed yesterday evening, but this is just for the purposes of informing the public. There were some constraints with the panelists, so exceptionally today, the panel discussions will end around 12:30 p.m. as well as today's session. So for those who have other things to do this afternoon, they can go ahead and do so.
Mr. Cameron, if you want to come to the podium. I understand it's you that will lead the panel this morning, so.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. My name is Gordon Cameron. I'm one of the Commission Counsel. Today we have a panel of 3 former National Security Intelligence public officials. Parties might have had a chance to read their biographies, but I'll do a brief introduction of them. Seated closest to the council tables is Mr. Richard Fadden. Mr. Fadden served as Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service from 2009 to 2013 and was then the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister in 2015 and 2016. Prior to that, he held various deputy minister positions, including the Deputy Minister of Defence in the government. And currently, among other roles, he is a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Seated beside Mr. Fadden is Mr. Alan Jones. Alan Jones began his working career with the RCMP and then moved to CSIS, where he held various operational and management positions, rising to Assistant Director of Operations at CSIS, thus responsible for all operational programs, and then as Assistant Director for Technology, which included both corporate and operational technology. He is currently an Executive Advisor in the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute for courses on national security and cybersecurity. Mr. John Forster joins us by video link. And Mr. Forster was the chief of the Communications Security Establishment, which is, as you might have learned from some of the filed materials, the federal government's agency for signals intelligence and cybersecurity. He was in that position from 2012 to 2015. Prior to that, he too held various deputy minister and associate deputy minister positions, including as Deputy Minister of Defence. And since his retirement from the government, he has continued as a consultant with CSIS, with national defense, and with infrastructure and communities. Madam Commissioner, what we plan to do first is to have the panelists make a opening presentation expressing some of their views on the topics that are before us today. And though there's no necessary order to this, we've decided that we would begin by asking Alan Jones to begin with his comments. So, Mr. Jones, could you get us started?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I thought I might start my comments with making some commentary on the panels yesterday, which I found very informative. I was here yesterday, and there was a discussion and some information offered that I thought I would offer some comments on for context. One, I thought the overview by Professor Leah West on the process around Section 38 was extremely useful, and the comparison to what happened in the Arar Commission was informative and useful and a very appropriate way to introduce those topics to this commission, because things will probably unfold in a similar manner, although obviously there's been some evolution of that process and the law since that. I was very grateful for Professor West's submission on that. One point that did not come out clearly I thought I would make was the classified information is not owned per se by the agencies. It is owned by the Crown. Information is governed by federal law, by precedents, by federal policy, and the decisions for disclosure are made on behalf of the government of Canada, not solely on the volition of agencies for what they would and would not want to disclose.
Excuse me, Mr. Jones, could you move the microphone closer to your mouth just to make sure the interpreters and people can hear you better?
Is that better? Okay. There was also a considerable reference to the Arar Commission, of which I had considerable involvement in. And I think the process around disclosure in Arar is very relevant to this commission, but I was a bit not concerned, but I don't necessarily view, actually I don't view at all, that the focus of the Arar Commission, which was on wrongdoings, is the focus of this commission. I think that there is quite a divergence in the terms of reference for this commission to the Arar Commission, and I was a little concerned that the impression would be left that this focus was on wrongdoings by whoever, which changes the complexion of a number of things. One, it changes the complexion of requests for disclosure, particularly if it's to third parties, where a third party, if it's another country, is because other countries are watching this process, this is public, that another country, if it is asked to disclose into a commission on wrongdoings, then may take something of a defensive position about what it is willing to disclose compared to a request for disclosure for fact-finding. The other being, if there is a perception of wrongdoing, criminal wrongdoing, as there was in Arar, that has an effect on the type of disclosure, the credibility information, the source of information. I just wanted to make that as a clear point that I think this commission is not Arar 2, so to speak, and in terms of its focus and its intent, but the analog for the process around disclosure in Arar is very relevant. The other point I would make about Arar, the subject matter was totally different. It was counterterrorism as opposed to foreign interference, which involves different agencies, a different methodology for how that information is collected, how intelligence is produced, and obviously the context of Arar was at post 9/11, which was a different time than we are in now. In reference to third-party caveats, we are, as the comment was made, a net importer receiver of intelligence produced by allies and partners, primarily the Five Eyes, but also NATO, but also others. Government of Canada has relationships with many different organizations worldwide. The world is bigger than the Five Eyes and NATO, and those relationships are all important. But I think what is important to bear in mind is those other countries run their intelligence programs not for the benefit of Canada. They run their programs for the benefit of protecting their own countries. Intelligence that they provide to Canada is a byproduct, or sometimes an intentional product of their own interests are involved, of their programs which are designed to protect themselves. They will disclose intelligence to Canada, share intelligence with Canada for collective security. They'll disclose if they believe that there is a threat to their own country that is emanating from Canada or from someone or organization linked to Canada, and they're looking for cooperation. They will disclose as general information for a broad-based threat. They will disclose sometimes just to be in good standing with Canada because they have other relations, even economic and tourism relations, that they want to make sure that Canada understands that they're safe and they're working hard to keep their borders safe. But their primary intent of producing intelligence is for their own purposes. So when Canada makes a request for disclosure and there are at risk their sources, whether they're human sources, technical sources, or they're covert operators working for their agencies, or their methodologies, they must, in their deliberations about disclosure, measure the impact on their own national security when providing that information to Canada or reviewing any type of disclosure request for public disclosure. So it is not simply that they're looking at how it affects Canada, it affects them. There's also an element that was discussed yesterday of the time that it takes to process disclosure requests and go through the Section 38 process, Canada Evidence Act, and it is slow. It is not simply a Canadian process. When Canada makes that request to a third party, to another country, that request ends up going to specialized sections within those agencies, which are policy and legal sections, who tend to be swamped with requests from their own internal processes, whether they're preparing documents for congressional hearings, for parliamentary or state inquiries, or responding to lawsuits or responding to other countries. So I think it's important to understand that although it is tempting at times to think that another country is dragging its feet and doesn't want to cooperate, you're entering into yet another bureaucratic process where deliberations take a long time and the response time is not necessarily compelled by the response time of a Canadian interest. They have to look at their own priorities as well. And while pressure can be put to say, look, this is very important, we need you to respond within this time frame, There's often goodwill. They often do understand. Many countries want to understand, do understand that this is important. They have their own pressures to deal with. There was a comment made about sometimes that there is tension around even asking another country for disclosure on certain topics. Most of the countries that Canada deals with, Five Eyes and NATO, that's really not an issue. They have their own processes. They understand why we would be asking those questions. They may not be happy about it because sometimes they would wish that Canada would resolve its own issues without asking them to have to become part of it. But that there's no real risk of damage to the relationship. We'll work that through. Other countries who do not have similar systems to Canada, who do not have a rule of law, who don't have democratic governments, not liberal democracies, their response to these types of questions sometimes is quite different. They don't understand why they're being asked. They'll try and overlay their own lens as to why we'd be asking those questions. That sometimes requires a lot of finesse, a lot more work, and sometimes they just simply either don't respond or they say no. The types of responses that you can get can be a yes, we will disclose. We will disclose part of what you want, but not all of it. But sometimes you get a nuanced response, which is we have disclosed this to the government of Canada for you to use as you require, but we'll also hold you accountable for the consequences of your disclosure. This is that middle ground gray area where you have to make decisions about what you disclose and you don't. So it's not, again, there's no formula for this and no written rules. There's very ample discussion yesterday about the need to protect human sources. Obviously, we have an obligation, legal and moral, to protect people who are putting their lives at risk, to provide intelligence to Canada, to protect Canada. Often they are providing intelligence to Canada, particularly in the context of foreign interference, because they want to protect themselves, their families, their communities, and others. But they are concerned that the exposure of their cooperation with the government would have negative consequences on them reputationally, in business, or more dire consequences to their family and their interests back in whatever country that is the source of the coercion or the intimidation or the interference. These are real issues. These are real street-level issues that you have to deal with when you're dealing with a disclosure request, because these are human beings. The disclosure of technical sources, and there was a comment yesterday that was made that I thought was worth repeating, is in intelligence reports, the source is not disclosed in reports itself. In fact, the type of source is not referenced. There is no reference to whether it is a human source or a technical source, because the mere reference as to whether it is a human or a technical source can point to exactly what that source is. So the source itself is anonymized in average reporting. The identity of that source is always kept separate and a separate process. And that is done for the need-to-know principle and to protect those assets. Technical assets are often, a technical source has often been deployed or put in place with the support of a human source. So you can't necessarily partition those disclosure requests. Technical sources are often very, very expensive, but they also come with their own risks. And the risks are that a human source may have been in support, or that individuals may have been operating in covert positions where there is physical risk to put that source in place. Just as a bit of an anecdote, without hyperbole, I think most people are aware that in the CIA lobby, there's a memorial wall with stars on the wall. For every CIA agent that has been killed, there's a star on the wall. The NSA, which is the CSE's equivalent, has a similar memorial wall. There are more stars on the NSA wall than there is on the CIA wall. So the physical risk around technical sources is not trivial. It's not inconsequential. It does exist for various reasons. But there are risks to these. It's not simply a technical source. In both of those cases, whether it's a human source or technical source, they've been developed often over years of time. They've been developed because there's a need for them. And so if there's a loss of them, you also lose the ability to produce that intelligence reporting on future threats. So that goes into the disclosure considerations as well, is if you lose those sources for a disclosure, although it may be a very important reason, how do you replace them? And are you leaving yourselves vulnerable because there is a gap? Just to sum up, I've outlined a lot of things of concerns based on the conversations yesterday, but I have long believed that there is scope for more disclosure of the good work that is done by the intelligence services in Canada on behalf of the people of Canada and the government of Canada, that there are ways that we could look at being more transparent, but managing to protect those sources, those risks in future. I'm not sure that the current rules and laws as they're interpreted now have been as innovative as possibly as they could be in a modern context, and that there may be ways to interpret. I'm not going to go too far down that road because there's legal issues in there, but I think that there is a very, at times, the narrowest interpretation of risk based on the various ways that disclosures can happen, that there may be latitude or an innovation in scope for broader disclosure. One of them might be, is what I would call a temporal issue, is over time, the risk of disclosure may be mitigated. Not necessarily. Well, there are times when a human source, for as long as they live, has to be protected, or a technical source as long. But there are circumstances when a risk that may have existed to disclosure of information that is a year or 2 or 5 years old is not the same as the information that is longer, 10 years old, or even in a different time span. And I'm not sure we've ever really looked at that temporal aspect at the depth that possibly we could as to what that means. That is one example. But I think more work needs to be done. I think it is very important for the credibility of agencies, for the people of Canada and parliamentarians to understand why agencies are doing what they're doing, to understand the good work that is being done on behalf of the people of Canada. And the only way to do that is to be more transparent. And I think I urge that more work be done on this in future. So I've laid out a bunch of risks, but at the same time, I want to put that marker down is we need to do better on disclosure than we have in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And now, Mr. Forster, if we can hear some comments from you. Let's see if the video link, comes up.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, that's working well.
Okay, great. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. As Gordon mentioned, I worked in several departments in my career, 3 of which involved national security and defense. At Transport Canada, we were consumers of intelligence to try and identify threats to the transportation system, particularly aviation, such as putting in place a liquid ban overnight due to a flight from the UK. As chief of the communications security establishment, we were collectors of foreign intelligence that we provided to other departments. And finally, as Deputy Minister of National Defense, which has a very significant intelligence function, we were both a collector and a consumer of intelligence to assist the armed forces. I'll start off by saying I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a specialist in intelligence classification, but I thought I'd share a few perspectives from my experience as both a collector and consumer of intelligence products. And I support the inquiry's view that, it wishes to be as transparent as possible and to make as much information public as possible. In fact, there was many times, especially when I was at CSE and during many appearances in front of parliamentary committees, when it would have made my job as a head of one of these agencies a lot easier to disclose classified or explain the operations of my department. But even if it wasn't against the law, there were real reasons that prevented me from being able to do that. So I'll touch on a few of these, and Alan mentioned some of them already, but I'll touch on a few of the key constraints that we faced. First, intelligence agencies like CSE and CSIS must at all costs protect their sources, their techniques, their technology. So when you publish a report about a conversation, even if you take out names and you redact locations and some of the specifics, you can easily divulge who or how the information was obtained. And that puts your sources at risk, or your target will take steps to evade your technology and techniques, and you go dark. And so that's always going to be a very critical consideration. Second, important to remember, intelligence is not fact. Their disinformation campaigns are escalating. Attribution, particularly that's identifying the real source of the information, particularly in the cyber domain where CSE works, can be extremely difficult. And so as a result, if you publish a report, even with varying degrees of confidence, there may be a risk of inadvertently disclosing information before further analysis confirms or corrects it. Third, intelligence requires good analysis and context. So when I began at CSE, I was cautioned about consuming raw intelligence, a report of a conversation, a report of a meeting, because they can be misleading. So analysts combine an in-depth knowledge of their subject, the trends, the context, reporting from different sources to eventually build an assessment. So when you publish a single individual report, it may mislead the reader who doesn't have access to other critical reporting and context. This is a caution I shared with previous ministers of national defense. Now, fourth, as Alan mentioned, a lot of the information is not ours to share. We are a huge net importer of intelligence. We rely on our allies, particularly the Five Eyes, particularly in the SIGINT world, for much of it. And we consume more than we produce. And so the originator of the intelligence imposes their conditions or caveats on how we can use it, and we need their approval. And if you disclose it without that approval, no matter, and it may take a long time, they'll simply stop sharing with you. And Canada would be severely weakened. Finally, another key point I think to mention is the need to know, as Alan referenced it earlier. Some of the intelligence is so sensitive, the source is so crucial, and the information so valuable, there are only a handful of people in the federal government that have access to it. It's compartmentalized, it's highly restricted, and you must be indoctrinated to review it in a secure location. It's not routinely available even to people with a top secret clearance, and that goes for deputy ministers as well. So does this mean that all intelligence needs to be kept secret and can't be made public? Not at all. And I think, in fact, CSIS wants to be able to share more of its intelligence with government. And it's really important that the inquiry has the access to what it needs and can challenge the government on what can be released. So there's 3 points I'll make in that respect. One, I think it's important for participants and the public to remember that, as I understand it, the inquiry will have full access to all of the unredacted information. So even if they can't release it or refer to it explicitly, the inquiry certainly will be able to consider it in doing its work and formulating its findings. A second, the inquiry can and should challenge the government to justify what can't be released and why. Departments do, on occasion, overclassify material. There can be a natural inclination to default to less is more. of an initial decision by an expert. And even though the inquiry can challenge it to the Justice Department or to court, it's so time consuming and resource intensive, both for the inquiry and the government, that I think a spirit of cooperation will be critical, and it will need to be communicated by the government at the senior level. The third point I would make is I think it will be important for the government and agencies to produce unclassified versions of reports, public summaries, or an unclassified assessment. It's not necessary that specific details, names, locations, dates, specifics of a conversation necessarily be disclosed to get the gist of the report and what its impacts are on the inquiry's mandate. There is no simple kind of general rule nor one-size-fits-all solution that we'll find. Each report will require careful consideration. There are real risks at stake. And public interest in transparency is very important, but it must be balanced also against very real and serious national security interests, which are also in the public interest. So I think the public debate the inquiry is hosting this week is really an important and very valuable one. And I'll conclude there and turn it back to Gordon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forster. And now, Mr. Fadden, could you give us your remarks?
Good morning. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I should say in starting, I have a moderately bad head cold, so if I sound like Donald Duck, I apologize. I'm going to apologize again to the plethora of lawyers, I guess including to myself as a lapsed lawyer, that I'm not going to talk very much today about the law governing confidentiality and openness. I acknowledge their importance and the fact that if my remarks take me outside that ambit, any number of people will correct me. But what I'm going to try and do today is to present to you a practitioner's practical perspective on this topic. And I should say that over the years, I've had some jobs where the emphasis was on protection and other jobs where the emphasis has been on openness. So if I come across as schizophrenic, it's in fact intentional. So I think from a practitioner's perspective, you start with a recognition that the law needs to be respected, and then you move on. In a democracy absent clear constitutional or legal direction to the contrary, openness and transparency is the default. And I can remember that we often used as an example the old Soviet Union, where everything was classified unless there was a clear indication that it could be made public, and that the reverse was true in Canada, that everything was open unless there was clear direction that it had to be kept classified. I can't say that that particular perspective was shared by everybody, but it should have captured, I think, the distinction between ourselves and our adversaries. I think we have to acknowledge that the law pushes both sides. For example, the Security of Information Act pushes towards protection, and the Access to Information Act pushes towards openness. But my first key point is that all laws and policies are very susceptible to both bureaucratic and institutional and personal interpretation. The commissioner wouldn't have her full-time job if that's not true. I mean, we interpret at all levels within the bureaucracy, within the judiciary, and this has an impact on what people do with the laws and the policies. And I think this is important because these interpretations over time result in the creation of a culture which can and does become as determinative of what's released as the actual law and policies. So CSIS or GAC or CSE each develop a broad approach to classifying, declassifying, and releasing information that is unique to that institution. Approaches which also, as John and Al have pointed out, are also guided by third-party counterparts. And if you have a number of institutions that have contributed to a particular piece of intelligence, almost always the default is to classify to the highest level sought by any given institution. It's very rarely that you end up with the lowest common denominator or the lowest common classification. So with the possible exception of PCO, the agencies we are mostly concerned about have closed personnel systems, which I think reinforces this culture. And by closed personnel system, I mean you join CSIS as a boy or girl spy and you want to become the director. You join CSE as a cryptologist and you want to become the chief. And that really results in a culture that's very, very, very strong. Just say a couple of words about PCO, which stands at some distance from other departments and agencies, both in terms of working for the Prime Minister, but also in the national security area, they have distance, which is something that departments and agencies don't have. And it's like anybody who works in a specialized area. You concentrate it long enough, hard enough, and you develop this sort of closed world view of what you're doing, including decisions to classify or declassify. PCO can be very helpful, having all the clearances and whatnot. When something is important enough, they ideally are able to take a broader perspective. Certainly when I was NSA, that was required of us on a few occasions. You then negotiate with the departments and you point out that there's often or sometimes a broader perspective than that can be seen by individual departments and agency. So I'm not suggesting, a conscious desire on the part of agencies to disregard my default position, but rather a conscious effort to legitimately protect information. And the balance there is I think, clearly in favor of protection. I think over time, the protective culture becomes dominant. And this actually sits well with ministers and central agencies and senior officials, especially when the protective effect, the practical effect, is reducing the likelihood of controversy. I'm not suggesting that controversy or partisanship very often plays a role, but if by happenstance you're invoking protection under particular legal provision, means that you're not releasing something that would cause all sorts of controversy, there's nobody in the system that points in the opposite direction. And I'll come to this in a minute, but there's no openness advocate in the entire system because the Access to Information Commissioner doesn't play on these highly classified matters. So everybody sort of goes in with the expectation that they're maintaining an appropriate balance. And if I'm correct, the balance is sometimes tilted in favor of protection because of the culture that I talked about. And it often means that very, very quick decisions are taken because you have the volume of material and you have a culture that indicates that you're going in a particular direction with respect to classification. This is also true when you're getting information or intelligence from the same source, the same methodology, or you're producing the same kinds of reports. And it might be interesting for you to ask to what extent my successors use algorithms as opposed to the human brain to determine classifications. I think that given the volume today, very, very frequently, everything's produced electronically. So why not introduce an algorithm that classifies, which can be reviewed if appropriate or necessary by human beings. But I suspect that in a lot of cases, the algorithm wins. And I think in this system, it's important to note too that appeals outside the system, they're difficult, they're lengthy, and they're expensive. So if you can't get somebody within the system to respond to a request. So my central point is that while much of the information that you will be interested in deserves protection, and John and Al have pointed out a good number of reasons why, the culture, the workload, and the tradition in agencies, I think, is to tend towards overprotection. Not always the case, but it's frequently the case. Again, I want to stress the absence of an openness advocate in all of this, with the possible exception of the Department of Justice, which unfortunately tends to focus on the law. It's a joke, and a bad one, it seems. And PCO, where the files, if they're important enough, they merit consideration there. So what I'm trying to say in my roundabout way is there is room to push because of this overprotection, this culture. And I don't know in the context of this commission to what extent PCO and DOJ are going to be involved in individual decisions, but I would commend to you the view that if you have a lot of trouble getting openness, you, Commissioner, should consider talking to the Clerk of the Privy Council, who is the guardian of all of these things for the public service and the statutory guardian of cabinet secrets. So before suggesting a couple of ideas to consider as it works its way through specific reports to the Commission, let me revert to the practical and try and put myself in the shoes of people who are working in the system and who have to deal with all sorts of secrets. And I think in the practical sense, there are three kinds of secrets. There are national security secrets that we've talked about this morning. There are national interest secrets that have been discussed yesterday and Al alluded to briefly, and then there are cabinet secrets. And everybody has to be aware of these as they work their way through the classification process and the release process. Each have their own rules, each have their own culture, but I think for your purposes, probably the most important is the national security secrets. Cabinet secrets, as you know, are entirely the prerogative of PCO and nobody else plays on them, or if they do, it's at the risk of their lives. But national interest information is often in the background and is often passed on to analysts and access to information shops, which don't necessarily have a picture of what the national security implications are. So what I'm trying to say again in my roundabout way is that these three categories sometimes overlap and interlock with one another, and disaggregating them is an important part of the process. In the absence, again, I'm repeating myself, but in the absence of an openness advocate, things tend to be classified more than they need to be. So a couple of concrete thoughts. If you believe that what I'm saying has some value, this culture bit, trying to get the government to admit that this plays a role would, I think, help you discuss on a practical level individual declassifications. Agencies do get too close to their material, and there has to be a way to provide some distance. I don't know if you have this within the commission, but hiring somebody who's recently retired and worked in this area would, I think, be helpful, explain the mindset of people. I know people like Mr. Cameron have worked in this area for a long time, but it's not exactly the same as finding a practitioner who's recently retired to give you a bit of an insult. Involve PCO to play the openness advocate. This should be consistent with the Prime Minister's view that he wants all of this information to be as open as possible. I think another area that's worth thinking about is our allies, our close allies, are much, much more open than we are. They really protect their core secrets, but the Brits, the Yanks, the Australians tend to be much more open than Canada is. And, you know, you can often point to something that they've released that's very close to what you want to release and ask the officials, why can't we do this? Al has alluded to the question of passage of time. I think that's very important. One of the issues that came up when I was still working was, well, let me stop for a second. I suspect that you're not going to be looking at every piece of raw intelligence that's produced in the period for which you have a mandate, and a lot of it will be consolidated analyses of one point or one sort or the other. And one of the reasons sometimes that things are classified is because the individuals, the officials, don't want to release a set of information that relates to one of the things that John or Al pointed out about, while at the same time, all of this information is in the public domain. And one of the reasons that I used to push back a little bit on my colleagues is because within the national security community, people will always prefer national security collected information over the fact that The Economist has reported this or it appears on CBC on the evening news. I'm exaggerating slightly to make my point. But if you can argue with officials that all of this information is broadly speaking public, why don't you just take it from that perspective and forget about the collection angle and somewhat change your summaries or your actual final analysis being presented. And I think the other point I would just make, and then I'll stop talking, is, and it's a device that I used in talking to parliamentary committees, is that you can take a lot of intelligence and aggregate it up a level It doesn't change the substantive message, but you just lose a little bit of the detail. But in the end, nothing is lost. And I think it's important to remember that ministers and senior officials very rarely get raw intelligence. They get analytical reports. So everybody getting all upset because they can't read the particular CSE intercept that, took place on date X from person Y, that may or may not be important for the historians, but ministers, the prime minister and senior officials rarely, if ever, get that. They will get consolidated reports, they will get analytical reports, and it's in these kinds of reports, I think, where you have a little bit more flexibility to argue that, if you take out two words or if you aggregate up a level or if you compare them to the allies, you might get them to release. So I don't mean to suggest as I conclude that I'm in favor of releasing everything. I think there are some secrets that are it's absolutely critical to protect. But that doesn't mean that there should not be discussions on the interpretation given by officials on what particular point of information can be released or not. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fadden. Gentlemen, as we all know, we will tomorrow have, roughly speaking, your counterparts, plus someone from PCO who are currently incumbent in positions that you held in the course of your careers. And so we will have an opportunity to get perhaps a more detailed account of how the institution of CSIS works, how CSE works, but just so that we can put the comments you've made today and some of the points we might be able to explore in the time left to us into context, I'd like to ask each of the agencies, so to speak, to describe, roughly speaking, the type of work you do with a view to contrasting the two of them. In particular, people hear CSIS, they hear CSE. For a lot of people, I think the mere emergence into the public of CSE is a relatively new phenomenon. So if I could ask either or both of you, Mr. Fadden and Mr. Jones, to talk about the type of work CSIS does, and then Mr. Forster, I'll ask you to describe the type of work that CSE does, and hopefully the participants will have a better perspective on what different types of intelligence is originating from the two agencies.
Well, if I may, I'll start with just a couple of general comments. Al was far more involved in operations than I was, but the first comment I'd like to make is the law makes it very clear that CSIS must distinguish between domestic intelligence and foreign intelligence. It's the sort of thing that permeates the agency. In both cases, you can incidentally collect the other kind of intelligence, but fundamentally, CSIS was created to be a domestic intelligence agency. It was to worry about sabotage, terrorism, sedition, and things like that. And while today there's a clear shift towards being able to collect foreign intelligence both here and abroad, the agency, the service, clearly distinguishes the two. And the law requires that, and it's one of the, if I may be so bold, one of the fixations, in my view, the exaggerated fixations of the federal court, but that's for another debate over a glass of wine. But that sort of view permeates everything that they do, and we have to be very careful to do that. The other general statement I would make is that the law allows one agency to ask another agency to do something within its mandate that it cannot technically do. So CSIS regularly asks CSE to do some collection for it as long as it's clearly within CSIS's mandate. So I say this to make the point that while both agencies have very clear mandates, John will explain CSE's, which is more focused on foreign affairs, but CSIS can make use of CSE's technical capabilities as long as it's well within its own legal mandate, and it does so on a regular basis. And in fact, it can do the same of any other institution in the government of Canada. So that just those two macro points, along with the indication that CSIS collects all of this stuff to be helpful to the government. So there's always a judgment to be made about what is used internally to develop broader reports and what is kicked into the system that heads up to the ministers, and to agencies around town. But a lot of stuff that CSIS collects doesn't leave the agency because it's too specific, it's too narrow, it doesn't really apply to particular interests today. There are other things, pardon me, there are other things that CSIS does, like do security clearances and whatnot. But I think I'll stop there. Al is probably better equipped than I am to talk a little bit about some of the more specific operational issues of what CSIS does.
Sure, I'll start with the mandate in the CSIS Act, which is, as someone once said to me who had come into the service from outside the public service, they had never met a group of people who walked around carrying their act all the time like people did at CSIS. It really does guide what you do on a daily basis. Because everything flows from that act, including all the internal authorities for operational activities must reference back to the act itself, to Section 12, which is the primary mandate to collect by investigation or otherwise threats to the security of Canada, and then the specific threats under 2A, B, C, and D of the CSIS Act, A being espionage, B being foreign interference, C being terrorism, and D being subversion, which is a muted authority at the moment, hasn't been used in many years. So the service, as Dick said, is primarily is a domestic service, or in intelligence parlance, a security service. I know the RCMP was called a security service, but internationally, countries have what's called a security service. It deals with internal security. In the UK, it would be MI5. In the United States, the intelligence part of the FBI. Australia, it's ASIO, et cetera, et cetera. It has a hybrid foreign intelligence mandate under Section 16, where the service can collect on behalf of Department of Global Affairs Canada or National Defence intelligence as foreign intelligence, but only within Canada. On the security intelligence side, Section 12, there is no geographic restriction on where CSIS can operate. We protect, the service protects, I still use the royal we after decades of being there. The service protects Canada and Canadians anywhere on the planet. So you're looking at the security of Canada and Canadians at home, and you're looking at the security of Canada and Canadians abroad. And many of the threats against Canada emanate from abroad, so you have to go where the threats are active in order to get the intelligence you need to protect Canada. CSIS also has, under Section 21, the authority to intercept private communications. This is called lawful access. Tapping telephones, putting microphones in walls, all these things CSIS does, publicly known. CSE has a tremendous technical capability for signals intelligence, which is, generally speaking, outwardly facing from Canada, not aimed at Canadians inside Canada. But the types of intelligence that John can talk to more detail than I can, that CSE collect, CSIS doesn't have the technical capability to do, so it is supported. There's mutual support. And both consume each other's intelligence. We provide intelligence to CSE, which they need to help focus their mandate, and likewise. So that is the broader mandate of CSIS. It also provides security assessments for government screening. So when people get security clearances, CSIS does an investigation based on its mandate. It also provides investigations and clearances on immigration. So when people are coming to Canada, they go through a CSIS check as well. That's the primary overview of what CSIS does. And I'll just add, there's no powers of arrest in Canada.
See into the picture.
Sure, thanks, Gordon. So the communication security staff became its own separate agency and its own legislation. It does still report to the Minister of National Defense, but is separate. One is, as has been mentioned, signals intelligence, which is really electronic communications in all its forms. Another important distinction is its mandate is foreign, not domestic. So it is not allowed to collect information intentionally on Canadians, not just in Canada, but anywhere in the world. And if it inadvertently comes across that, it has to take steps to desensitize it and remove it. It's a provider of raw intelligence largely, and it provides it to the rest of government. So CSIS, RCMP, GAC, National Defense, CBSA. So it provides intelligence reports for others to do their analysis and take appropriate action. It does have an assistance mandate, so it may assist CSIS, National Defense, RCMP, to do domestic operations, but they're really they're undertaking that work on behalf of the agency and under their mandate. So they're kind of a technical arm for other departments. The second key part of its mandate is on cybersecurity. So it protects the federal government, Government of Canada's IT infrastructure from cyber attacks and hackers. It recently got a mandate not just to block and prevent those attacks, but it can take steps online in the global communications infrastructure to deter those attacks as well. And then it has the Cybersecurity Center, which is more the public-facing arm of its mandate on cyber to work with the private sector, other levels of government to help them with their cybersecurity and assistance and advice to Canadians. And I think that kind of captures most of what the CSE does.
Thank you, Mr. Forster. One point that we wanted you to just describe, it's probably something you can explain very simply, but we have seen reference, well, and you've described it yourself, that CSE collects signals intelligence. First of all, can you just describe for us what, broadly speaking, signals intelligence is?
Yeah, sure. It's largely electronic communication. So CSE, unlike CSIS, does not have human sources. So it's really focused on the global communications infrastructure. Could be cell phone conversations, text, computer, any kind of computer communication. So it really operates in that realm off the global communications infrastructure.
And if you can explain why is it that signals intelligence tends to have special designations and special treatment?
It has certain classifications because of the nature of the technology or the sources of the information. So as I mentioned in my remarks, some of these, you don't want to be disclosing your techniques, your technology, your capabilities, your sources, because the targets of your collection will simply take steps to avoid or block it. So its techniques and its technology and its access are extremely sensitive information. So reports, intelligence reports you produce from those can divulge those sources, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. So they take steps to make sure it's very carefully, access to that information is very carefully controlled. And some of it is, as I mentioned, not available to only a handful. It's only available to a handful of people in the government.
Right. Now, I'm going to move on to a different topic, but Mr. Fadden, Mr. Jones, is there anything you've wanted to add to the respective allocation of responsibilities between the two agencies before we move on to another topic? No? Okay.
I'll ask you, would you want us to discuss the disclosure regime for CSIS, is what it does with its intelligence within the community?
That's on my list, so let's go there now, yes.
Okay.
The types of intelligence reports you produce and the distribution and disclosure you make within the intelligence community.
Okay, so as Dick and I have often commented, there's not much point in spending a lot of time and money collecting intelligence and then just sitting there and admiring how clever you were at gathering it. It actually has to become useful at some point. So obviously, the service is very detailed in its reporting. One of the tenets of doing good intelligence work is attention to detail. So the reports are very detailed. We document everything. Things others might say, why would you document in such details? Because you don't know in the future when that detail may become relevant, and that detail may actually prove that what you thought about something in the first place was wrong or right. Data is somewhat self-correcting. The more of it that you get, the clearer the picture becomes. John mentioned earlier the risk in reading a singular report on a file. What you know at the outset of an investigation is often quite different than what you ultimately know after you explore more, do more investigation, more fact-finding, challenge what you know. You may end up at a very different place. We live in a global world where there's television is on, CNN's on all the time. My general rule in running operations was the first thing you hear on the television is wrong. You know, it will take time to actually figure out what happened. So we document everything in great detail. Those reports sit in a automated database because you need to be able to recover it and compare it and analyze it to other data and do it quickly. And those documents and that information is kept for many years because it may be years before you get more clarifying information or because what you know suddenly comes into context. I've seen many investigations where a piece of intelligence collected 7, 8, 10 years ago suddenly becomes key in understanding a threat that is developing. That's what intelligence services do. The threshold for what you collect is different than a criminal investigation. Former police officer, I was educated many times in the Superior Court of British Columbia by judges who informed me that what I believed was irrelevant is what I knew that was important. When you were doing intelligence investigations, you gather a lot of information that does not hit the level of what criminal evidence would be. Rumors, fractured pieces of information, bits and pieces, contradictory information. You often get things that are simply can't be two things at the same time, but yet you get information saying that it is. All of that sits in your database. All of it sits in reports. So learning how to read intelligence is very important. Learning how to understand what it is that's being presented to you, as John said, is very important. As Dick said, providing raw data to senior decision makers is often not useful because you don't want to turn the Prime Minister or a Deputy Minister into an analyst. And I have seen circumstances in the past, which are better now, where you were dealing with a crisis and the information that was coming in was almost raw. And so you had deputy ministers and senior officials sitting there trying to track in their mind all these reports that they've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which, as I said, is not necessarily the same every time you see it, and make sense of it. This is not a helpful way to run a crisis. So someone needs to do that work for seniors, and that is done. So that's where they're getting assessed information, analyzed information, and not just raw pieces of information thrown at them. We share information with other intelligence services because threats are global. You need to have cooperation to protect Canada. We sometimes come into possession of intelligence on a threat that is developing against an ally or a partner, even a country who you may not have the best of diplomatic relationships with. But if you find out that there's going to be, for example, a terrorist attack where there's life at risk, you have an obligation to try and tell the other country is, this is what we know, be careful. We don't want to sit on that information and allow something to happen on the other side of the world, just as we would hope that another country would not sit on information that would identify a threat to Canadians. When there is intelligence that is pointing to criminal activity, and criminal activity that either relates to one of those threats that I described, espionage is a crime in the criminal code, terrorism is a crime, we'll learn more about how much foreign interference actually becomes a crime or not. That when we get intelligence at that level, we have a mechanism or mechanisms to advise the police of jurisdiction. In a national security case, it's the RCMP. And there are mechanisms to do that. We have what's called a disclosure letter. There may be some changes to this. I'm a little dated. I am retired. You'll find out more tomorrow, I'm sure. But a disclosure letter, and these terms are a bit odd for anyone who's not familiar with them. There's a disclosure letter and an advisory letter. Disclosure letter would simply say to the RCMP or police jurisdiction, we've found out information about this we think is criminal activity. You may want to respond to this, but this information is ours. We're not disclosing it to you for court purposes or for anything else. We're just letting you know. An advisory letter is a more complex process. We are actually providing advice to the RCMP and saying, here's what we know and here's what you can use. And when you say, here's what you can use, this obligates the service to do certain things, whether it's retained intercepted communications, whether you've documented something, whatever. You start to become part of that process. The whole intelligence to evidence is a complicated piece. We'll get into that today. The service may also incidentally come across information that is not related to its mandate, but may be valuable to another department's mandate. So, or another criminal investigation. You might discover drug dealing or a bank robbery in the process of doing something else, so you would want to disclose the place of jurisdiction. We have discovered information which relates to Health Canada, which relates to Department of Environment, Department of Finance. We have a mechanism to say, this was incidentally collected. It's not part of our mandate. We weren't looking for it. We came across this information. It might be useful to you rather than not sitting in our databases and going nowhere. We can disclose this amount to you, and this is what we will agree for you to do with it. So that disclosure regime and those interrelationships are ongoing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're very active. These are not occasional things that you do. This is your life all day, every day in operations and CSIS.
May I add a thought?
Yes, please do.
I agree with everything that Alan said, but just to make a further distinction, the service produces report, CSE produces report, the military produce reports, GAC produces diplomatic reports, and every now and then so does CBSA and a bunch of other departments. There's a secretariat in the Privy Council office called the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, which is focused mostly on things foreign, but when there's an overlap with things domestic, they have a mandate. So their particular mandate is to consciously seek out reports and intelligence from anywhere in the Canadian government and anywhere from our allies. So they would take, for example, if they were producing a report on foreign interference by China, they'd take CSIS reports, CSE reports, they'd ask Foreign Affairs whether there's anything, they'd check into what the allies are saying. I think they now do open sources much better than they used to, and they will put this in a consolidated level report, which would most likely be the kind of report that would go to the Prime Minister, ministers, and senior officials. As Alan said, very rarely do you give very senior people a specific, narrow piece of intelligence. More broadly, the system distinguishes, I think, quite consciously, strategic analytical intelligence and tactical intelligence. Not that there's a rule or anything, but I just want to emphasize what Alan said. You don't give ministers tactical information about a terrorist attack. You may tell them that one is going to happen, but you don't give them the details. But you do, in a strategic report, pull together everything you might know about the origins of that potential attack or foreign interference or whatnot, so that they can make sense of it. But it might be interesting, given your interest in, I suspect your interest in what ministers and prime ministers knew in the context of foreign interference, to see what the IAS has produced in this context, which is the Prime Minister's Intelligence Secretariat, but the material is also made available to ministers and senior officials. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and we will be hearing from a representative of PCO tomorrow. But that's a good segue to the next question I was going to ask all of you. You've talked about the process by which intelligence and information is collected and made into the types of reports and intelligence products that your agencies produce. In that case, for an audience that is receiving and cleared to receive classified information. The next question for each of the agencies would be about situations in which you've been called on to make what will be explicitly public comments. That is, you're going to be appearing in front of a parliamentary committee, or perhaps you've been asked to create a briefing that is going to go to a cabinet or to some audience that isn't an appropriate audience for the classified information, or there's a report, even an annual report of your agency, something like that. What process do you go through? I'll put it to you, Mr. Fadden, you've been summoned to speak to a parliamentary committee on a topic that you know about almost exclusively as a result of your exposure to classified information, but you're about to be questioned. You'd like to be able to say something more than, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. What process do you go through to prepare yourself for an appearance like that?
I'm smiling because I have been bitten by that process once or twice. There are two phases to it. One is you produce written comments, which you make as close to what you want to say as possible. And if there's anything at all controversial with them, you share it with another department that might be interested. But in particular, if you're a senior official, if you're a deputy minister, you make sure that PCO is comfortable. So that's the written document that will go on the record. As is often the case, as you're going to demonstrate today with your questions, often before a parliamentary committee, the tendency to ask for more detailed information comes through questions, and there it's a matter of judgment. I've tried very hard, and mostly I think I've succeeded in doing what I suggested that you do, which is I try and aggregate up classified information or sensitive information so that you can make a general statement on the topic that you're being queried about. And I think that's what they pay you for. If you're a deputy minister or the director of CSIS or the chief of CSE, you have to demonstrate judgment about how much you can say, because the general rule under all of the governments for which I've worked is try to be as collaborative as you can in front of parliamentary committees without causing, all sorts of grief with allies or with the law. So there's no process. You can't plan for what parliamentary committees are going to ask you. So a lot of it is your understanding of the broad political environment, your understanding of the national security environment, and the application of judgment. And I've found, I don't know if John or Al's experience has been the same, that if you make even the slightest effort to aggregate up and to answer questions on the basis of your judgment, it works. But the written material, you process through the system.
Right, and if I can just ask, we've used the expression summarize or generalize. Is that roughly analogous to what you're calling aggregate up?
I guess you could. I've used it mostly in the practical context of, you have a report and you just remove some of the detail. I don't know if that's what you mean.
Yes.
But very often classifications are determined by, a word or a sentence or a paragraph. And without necessarily removing them, you can rewrite them to remove the detail a little bit.
Right.
And that goes on a lot. To be honest, I spent a bit of my time when I was NSA trying to convince the agencies to do that, because the higher the classification, the more difficult it is to get in front of people. And as both Al and I have said, the objective is to get it in front of people. So by aggregation, I just mean slightly diluting the detail, sometimes by shifting the wording, while still being very careful that you don't lose the core message.
Thank you. And an expression we've seen is right to release. In other words, a document that is created specifically with the objective of it being released to an unclassified context. Is that the same thing we're talking about?
Well, I guess in the end it is, yes.
Yes. Okay, Mr. Forster, can you describe how your agency approached that during your day? That is, situations where the agency had to produce either a briefing to an unclassified audience or an annual report or an appearance by you or one of your colleagues before in the public or before a parliamentary committee.
Sure. When I started at CSE, it was very, its general practice was not to disclose much of everything. In fact, it was only in the 80s that the government even acknowledged it existed. So, and the practice and the culture was not to say too much at all. We faced some a very healthy challenge and spotlight based on unauthorized disclosures of U.S. intelligence, where we actually now had to go to committee and talk about more openly about what we did and why we did it and how we did it. And we started producing material on the website that better explained. And we found that it's, as Dick mentioned, a lot of the classification comes from some of the details and that aren't really necessary to communicate the gist of what you're doing or what the issue is or the event that you're trying to communicate. So it's really finding a way to communicate it strategically. Here's the issue, here's the current state, while removing a lot of the details that may disclose your methodology, your technology, your sources, or embarrass the country or whatever. Or not embarrass, but damage your international relations. So I think it's similar to Dick said. It's finding that right balance, and there were times where since I was there, they're even more open now. So it's been kind of an evolution.
Like you to answer, and we'll resume. But before we break for that Q&A process, or any comments you'd like to make to just recap or cover some of the points that you've heard others talk about?
Just one small point, and it's drawing on what I'm trying to be helpful to the Commission about strategic intelligence. And I know a lot of people in this country advocate for the almost total release of classified information, which I don't think is possible. So, as I was trying to indicate earlier, the Prime Minister, to pick an official, rarely gets detailed, tactical, source-based intelligence. He gets strategic intelligence. So for those people who are asking for, raw intelligence or details, I guess my thought would be, why should they get it when the Prime Minister doesn't? Because he really doesn't get it, except in the most exceptional circumstances where, life and limb would be at risk. And I think that's true of most ministers and deputy ministers most of the time. Pardon me. There's this belief, I think, among some parties that, people go to the office in the morning and they read all these details of, what colors was the pajamas of the Consul General in Vancouver wearing and things like that. Well, it doesn't happen that way. You usually get fairly highly aggregated strategic intelligence. So my simple point is, if it's good enough for the Prime Minister, it should be good enough for everybody else, except there are always exceptions. But I just wanted to try and make that point. And not everybody in government gets all of this detail that a lot of people consider to be critical, when very often it's not. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner, that is the completion of this session, so it would be timely to take a break.
Yes, and we'll take a longer break just to make sure that the participants have the time to draft their question that they want to send to the Commission Council. Thank you. So we'll be back in about 30 minutes.
Okay.
Order, please. À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît. The hearing is in recess for 30 minutes. La séance est en pause pour 30 minutes. The commission will be commencing shortly. La commission commencera sous peu.
Agreed.
Order, please. Alors, s'il vous plaît. The sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission is back in session. Cette séance de la Commission sur l'ingérence étrangère a repris.
You can go on.
Now, gentlemen, we have a number of questions, a good number of questions, probably more than we have time to address them all individually, but helpfully in a way, many of the same questions were asked by different parties, so we're doing our best to amalgamate them together or aggregate them, as you would put it, Mr. Fadden, into single questions. Let me begin with one which we've received, as I say, in various forms from several parties, but I'll use one of the formulations to put the question to you. And it's probably a question that's more likely to have arisen in the context of CSIS and CSE, but Mr. Forster, we'd welcome your views on this as well, which is, how do your agencies approach considerations around intelligence you've received that might suggest that an individual is under threat or potentially a foreign is a target of foreign interference, and specifically if that individual is a parliamentarian? What would you do when you got that intelligence, and how would you approach possible disclosure issues in relation to that?
Well, let me take a stab at it, if I may. One, I would make the point that what would happen today is not what would have happened in my day. I think the current government has broadened considerably the instructions they've given to CSIS, in particular about forewarning people who may be threatened. But in my day, when I was at CSIS, if I had found out that somebody was under threat, parliamentarian or not, I would have found a way to do something about it. And I don't say that lightly. If it were a parliamentarian, I would have made sure my minister knows about it and that the Privy Council knew about it. If it was another person, my colleagues and I would have consulted and decided if it's a physical threat, you have to bring in the police, because at the time the service didn't have the ability to affect physical activities. But rightly or wrongly, I've always thought that CSIS had a mandate to deal with threats. Most of them were systemic or national level threats, but if individuals were threatened, we would have found a way to do something about it. And the more political it was, the more we would have made sure that ministers know about it. Is that a fair thing to say, Al?
Absolutely. If it involved a physical criminal threat or threatening as a criminal activity, that would be involved in the police of jurisdiction, usually the RCMP, and any contact would go through the RCMP. But the disclosure to a parliamentarian is governed at the headquarters level. It's not something just regional, would be done locally, a local decision in consultation and probably up through PCO to start with, which also deals with the security of parliamentarians and cabinet ministers.
And Mr. Forster, if your agency received intelligence to that effect, how would it be handled?
Right. So again, remember.
Oh, we've got an audio.
Hello. Can you hear me?
There you go. We got you now.
All right. Remember, ours is a foreign mandate. So if we pick that up through foreign collection, the CSE has a series of what they call crows. They're sort of people who just take very sensitive intelligence around to different departments to make sure they've got access and have read it. So we definitely would flag that with a couple of the crows to make sure that that intelligence was read and understood by some of the key agencies. And depending on the target, since it's a threat and a target, I would want to make sure my colleague, the director at CSIS, and the National Security Advisor were personally aware of it. Because again, CSE doesn't take action on the intelligence; they're a collector of it. But I would certainly want to make sure that the proper agencies who would respond to it were personally aware of it at the very senior level.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, during your discussion, and this was particularly a point that Mr. Jones and Mr. Fadden made, you talked about intelligence over time becoming, the disclosure of the intelligence becoming less injurious over time as it gets older. And the question is, could you expand on that? Is that invariably the case, or is there some intelligence that the confidentiality of which survives the passage of time?
It would be the latter. It's not invariably, case by case. As I said, there are some circumstances which protection of the source, particularly a human source, would endure for the lifetime of that source. There are other times when the circumstances have changed around that human source, or other circumstances which would mitigate those threats. With a technical source, they're similar, but not necessarily the same. I'll talk to a Section 21 warrant that the service would have intercepting a phone or whatever. That would be, it's top secret. The fact that that intercept would exist, it is highly protected. You don't reveal that it's happened. After a period of time, if you no longer have that intercept and there's no technological barrier, the risk to revealing that information would be mitigated, unless, of course, you had a human source involved in the deployment of that technology. But it's more likely to happen, but not as an absolute rule, more likely to happen with a technical source than a human source. And I would add to that, where the CSIS sits in a different world than the police. Police notify people after they've intercepted their phone for a period of time, unless there's a reason to continue protecting it under Part 6 of the Criminal Code. So that's a very different regime.
Right. Very different in the sense that the person is never told when there's been a CSIS interception.
Correct.
Another question about some of the answers you gave in our session earlier this morning, and Mr. Fadden in particular, you noted that the PM doesn't get raw intelligence, but rather strategic assessments without all of the technical details. And the question is the suggestion here that the Prime Minister is missing important parts of the picture when he or she makes their decision?
No, I don't think so. And if I didn't, I should have said there are always exceptions to that rule. I can think of one instance that I can remember where I gave a Prime Minister something from John's old shop because it was particularly relevant to something that was quite sensitive. But very, very rarely, and as I think all of us were trying to say, a lot of intelligence, including intelligence that has a physical outcome, is built up over time. It's rarely one single piece. It's rarely one source, that tells the whole story. So the objective in dealing with ministers and the Prime Minister is to pull all of these together so that they can understand what happened. There may be a list behind, an annex which sort of says, this has been going on since time X to time Y, and gives some sense of where we got the information. But no, I absolutely don't think that's the case. And to support that view, in all the times that I've worked with ministers and prime ministers, I can only think of one instance where I was asked to provide the raw intelligence. So I think if it had been a real issue with ministers, we would have been asked much, much more frequently.
Right.
Can I add just one thing to that is, when you're disclosing or briefing up on any of these issues, at the front of your mind is, why are you telling this person what you're telling them? Because most, whether it's a prime minister or any senior leader in an organization, usually the first question they'll say is, why are you telling me this and what is it you expect me to do about it? So these are policy decisions. You're briefing up because it's affecting policy. You're not looking for operational direction or operational input. So that would put into context the type of aggregated information or analyzing information is, why are you briefing the Prime Minister on this?
Again, on this point, I think it arose out of some of the comments you made this morning, Mr. Fadden, about higher level aggregated information being more appropriate for disclosure. And the question was, are you proposing that the Commission ask the government to prepare such reports for the purposes of its use in this inquiry, or is it that they should be looking for the higher level aggregated reports?
No, I certainly wasn't suggesting that new reports be prepared. Would, with the passage of time, it might give a different impression, but I think you'd probably gridlock the system if you started asking for these on a systematic basis. What I was suggesting is that if you have a particular report that you want to make public, and the government is not readily accepting your request, making a suggestion or asking them to make a suggestion on an existing report about how to aggregate up a level or two might be a way to go, but certainly not to create a new report.
Okay. Again, a number of questions about presumably arising in part out of some of the information that we've received, that the Commission has received over the last few days, about the role of the public interest in disclosure and weighing the importance of confidentiality for national security purposes and the public interest in disclosure. Where would that fit into the analysis in your agency's consideration of potential disclosures? Where, if ever, within your agency, would you be assessing the importance to the public of knowing this information when you're deciding what to disclose to the public?
Well, in theory, it takes place at every level. But in practical terms, I'm not sure it can be, utilized equally every time a piece of information is classified. My sense is that, this issue becomes important when for some reason or other the file is raised. It may be for legal reasons, it may be for tactical reasons, it may be for policy reasons, it may be because there's a media interest. But as a general routine, the individuals who classify reports are quite junior. And they have a series of criteria and they apply them, or the computer applies them for them. And answering the question that you pose can either take place because an individual file is pulled and, a more senior person is asked to focus on it, or because there's a declassification process that's ongoing, and that takes place in headquarters at a fairly senior level. In other words, the authority to classify information is fairly widely delegated. The authority to lower the classification or to declassify it is much, much less widely delegated. And it would be restricted to headquarters, and if the matter were at all sensitive, it would go to quite senior levels.
If I could add from an operational perspective, when there is a judicial, quasi-judicial process and a request for disclosure, there are specialized areas, policy and legal, that deal with that process. It is not dealt with by the operational area. So even as a senior operational leader, I would never have been asked, how much do you want redacted and how much do you want left in the clear? That would not be an appropriate question for me to become involved in as an operational manager. That would be managed by those who are managing the relationship with the judicial proceeding or whatever. You might be asked what to do a potential damage assessment around specific pieces of information if they were to be disclosed. What is the risk associated to that? But you would not be asking in an operational sense, should or shouldn't we be disclosing to the maximum or the minimum. That is handled otherwise, and those decisions are made there. I'm not sure if that's useful, but that's...
Yes, thank you. Mr. Forster, this seems the area of balancing the public interest seems to arise more downstream from the agency you were in, but do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with both Dick and Alan's comments. The other players in this, I think, that are important, depending on the sensitivity and the views of the inquiry and the originator. The Department of Justice would also play a role in this if they felt that the agency was maybe not disclosing everything it could, the justice lawyers would also intervene and make sure that provide a bit of a challenge to it. Have you considered this? And as Dick said, I think it would get elevated to a reasonably senior level to make sure that there's a broader perspective taken to it than just the subject matter expert who would have more of a narrow kind of focus view on, oh, is this disclosed my source or my information or my technique? So the justice and PCO would also, play a bit of a challenge function there, or should play a bit of a challenge function there to the agencies to make sure that the broader public interest and views are also considered.
Thank you. And we had several questions arising out of your comments, Mr. Jones, with respect to what went on in the Arar inquiry, and in particular whether we have lessons to learn from that process. And as I'll phrase one of the questions, do you think the matter was adequately described by Professor West yesterday, or do you have anything to add to that?
I don't have anything to add. I think Professor West did an excellent job of outlining the relevant part of Arar for regarding disclosure in the process.
Okay. Now, some questions about for either Mr. Jones or Mr. Fadden about the division within your agency between, this came out of your discussion of the terrorism investigations, but we are here in a foreign interference context. So could you describe how your agency divides its functions as between investigations of those two fields of interest, between terrorism and counter intelligence or foreign interference?
I mentioned earlier that the CSIS Act defines a lot of how CSIS operates and how it's organized. Section 2, defining threats, A, B, C, and D, you essentially have operational branches. An operational branch that deals with A, which is espionage, C, which is terrorism, which is the big, a big file. The foreign interference file tends to fall more under the A section, although it's section B of the Act as a specific threat. It has never been a particularly large program within the service. Counterterrorism obviously dominated for decades the investigative capabilities and resources of the service. CSIS has always maintained operational capability under 2A and 2B, primarily in its counterintelligence branch. Even during the years post 9/11, when counterterrorism became everything for many agencies, the service maintained a capability, albeit reduced, on its espionage and its foreign intelligence foreign interference investigations, while some of our allies reduced theirs to almost nothing, to a nub. And in fact, over a period of years, as other larger agencies in other countries began to get back into the espionage and foreign interference areas, they did approach the service because they were aware that we had maintained some capability, reduced from what it had been, but we did not turn the lights out, so to speak, on that program. And that meant we could keep expertise, language capabilities, knowledge, and some continuity on those files, even while the service was under tremendous pressure for the counterterrorism program. But they are kept separate. There are, of course, some areas where foreign interference overlaps with the terrorism program. There are some countries which are involved in state-sponsored terrorism, who play in the peripheries of other terrorist activities. So you have a terrorist investigation, but yet they do engage in political meddling in Canada at the same time. So that's at times almost a shared responsibility between some of the counterintelligence branch and the counterterrorism branch. And sometimes you just make arbitrary decisions as to which branch will hold that file. But there's sometimes an overlap.
Can I add a thought? Just about foreign interference. It's actually rather difficult to deal with because it means and a desire to influence under the radar. So if you look at the spectrum of human contact between just a social gathering and foreign interference with the threat of violence, you have a whole bunch of things in the middle, including diplomacy. So in the case of terrorism, you know, if anybody's futzing around with a bomb or something like that, it's pretty clear you need to pursue it. But if the Consul General of country X is talking to somebody over lunch, it could be foreign interference of the worst sort, or it could be a social meeting where they're sort of saying, well, you know, our two countries should get together and agree on this particular policy. So if there's no threat of violence involving the diaspora at issue, simply catching people, you know, who are engaged in active foreign interference of one sort or the other is in some ways more difficult than terrorism, where you have sort of something kinetic to deal with, because in many ways you're just dealing with conversations. There could be implied threats, there could be implied benefits and whatnot. But in many cases, I think the service or the RCMP have discovered FI efforts simply because they related, as Alan says, to other inquiries. But I just want to stress that, you know, people who say, well, you know, it's obvious, you know, that, you know, the Consul General of country X was talking to somebody, it's foreign interference. Well, it ain't obvious. It's part of the job of diplomats. I was a diplomat briefly early in my career, and it was my job to go out and try and influence that country. So finding where it's situated on the spectrum is actually quite difficult to do. And not unreasonably, Canada doesn't want to offend foreign governments unnecessarily. So you have to find something to hook on before the service or the RCMP can become actively involved. So all I'm trying to do is to suggest that there's a spectrum here, and before you can become actively involved, you have to make sure that there's a serious possibility of foreign interference. And as Alan suggested, sometimes it's easier if it's connected with another investigation.
And if I add to that, it gets even more complicated when countries use proxies and non-diplomatic actors to carry out foreign interference campaigns.
Can you elaborate on that, Mr. Jones?
Well, foreign journalists sometimes, certain media representatives could be part of a state campaign. To be very specific, I have a certain amount of exposure to the activities of the Republic of China in foreign interference in Canada. They have a multi-pronged approach. It might be diplomats at a consulate, but it might be trade representatives, journalists, tourism groups, just individuals coming to Canada. It may happen the interference may actually happen in China itself, where they have coercive abilities because they can reach families or meet dual citizens who are traveling to China back to see family or to do business. So it's not just simply, as Dick said, what defines an aggressive political campaign or aggressively standing up for your country or aggressively trying to get do economic lobbying. At which point does it become foreign interference and meddling? Clearly, if it's interfering with an election, well, you're into that category where, like terrorism, it's pretty clear if someone wants to put a bomb somewhere. But the gradients between something that stark and benign or acceptable activities, there's a lot of activities in the middle.
Okay. Now,
Can I just add a point as well on this?
Please do.
Yeah, just the other element of foreign interference is not so much the human contact inside Canada or whatever, but the online campaigns that are waged. So disinformation campaigns that could be state sponsored. They're so CSE would be trying to track and report on that activity. It's very difficult. You can, send that stuff through umpteen number of servers around the world to cover its source, or the countries may use third parties to do it on their behalf. But there's a disinformation component to the foreign interference, foreign influence that shouldn't be forgotten, and that will only get more difficult as AI technology advances further.
Thank you. Now, thank you, Mr. Forster, for bringing us. I think I want to bring the discussion we've just had back to the question of what can be disclosed, how do we deal with the information that the Commission's going to be looking at and get as much of it out to the public. And a question that we were touching on earlier is balancing the public interest, et cetera. And a question that's come in from several different parties in different ways is whether it would be, and if so, how it would be important for the Commission to be in touch with diaspora communities to get their perspectives on foreign interference and how it affects them, and thus how it might affect the public interest in disclosure of the intelligence about foreign interference.
Well, to be blunt, I think if you don't develop an interest in diaspora points of view, I think you will be missing an important component of your mandate. I mean, the threats to, diaspora communities for the purpose of advancing, foreign state objectives, I think is becoming increasingly clear. And one of the difficulties that we have is that most members of these diasporas come from a background where dealing with the police or the security services is the last thing they want to do. So even though they're threatened, they feel badly, they want to do something, calling up CSIS or the RCMP or anybody else, given their experience with security services back home, is not something they want to do. So we don't have as many of those contacts as I think we should have. So I would very much urge the point of view that the Commission should have an active outreach program, and possibly one that provides them with confidentiality, because people are scared. I'm generalizing, not everybody is, but members of some diasporas are just plain scared. I would argue also that one of the things that the government should do, and I hope the Commissioner will consider this in her recommendations, is to develop a means for diaspora community members to communicate with the government confidentially. Because walking into an RCMP substation or to a CSIS regional office, they don't want to do by and large. And so the only time we find out about this is if something goes very wrong. So it's too late to do anything about it. So long answer to your short question, but I very much hope that you don't miss the opportunity of speaking with diaspora representatives.
Mr. Jones? Sure.
I agree with that. I have nothing to add.
Yes. And Mr. Forster?
Yeah, I would certainly echo Dick's comments.
Okay. Commissioner, I am in the happy situation of having completed all of the questions that the parties submitted, though in many cases they were aggregated together. Some of them will be punted to tomorrow's panel, where we have the incumbent equivalents of these gentlemen, and the questions will be more appropriate for them. But with that said, that is much as I have for this panel.
So thank you. I imagine everyone will be happy to be free for lunch and for the afternoon. So see you all tomorrow morning at 10.
Order, please. À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît. This sitting of the Foreign Interference Commission has adjourned until 10 tomorrow. Cette séance de la Commission des Affaires étrangères est levée jusqu'à 10 heures demain.